Hello, welcome to Shaka Extra Time, a show that comes to you every Tuesday. I am Paul Ndiho, and joining me from his home in Arlington, Virginia is Shaka Sali himself, aka the Kawale Kid. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Ndugu Paul.
How are you?
I remain simple, easy, and as some of my fans have suggested, an awesome son of Africa.
African Americans in the United States commemorated a very poignant moment in the history of slavery and how African Americans were proclaimed as free after they had fought for their lives, fought for so much, built this country on their back. Maybe speak to that.
There's no question that Juneteenth, as they call it, is a remarkably huge occasion. Mind you, this is the time when, in a sense, legal slavery, as we had come to know it, came to an end. And very ironically, by the way, is that in fact, the president, Abraham Lincoln, who had led the United States of America during the Civil War that raged in the 60s, had signed an Emancipation Proclamation at the end of the Civil War, which was 1863. But you cannot believe that it wasn't until 2 years later, we are talking about 1865, that the news of that Emancipation Proclamation arrived in the state of Texas, that slavery had ended. One wonders, honestly, how it could have taken that long. Perhaps the reason why there was a delay of 2 years for the news to reach Galveston, Texas, was because of the fact that during that time, there was no luxury of social media as we know it today. And the people at the time that had the advantage, perhaps, of having unfettered access to the media that was king at the time, which was the printing press, were the slave masters. They obviously did not seem to be in a hurry to lose what they considered to be their property. And at the time, slaves, for the most part, except for the women, by law, were not in fact allowed to learn to read and write. So it's amazing that here they were supposed to be legally free, but in terms of the reality that they lived, the de facto, they remained a sort of de facto slaves. It's also equally interesting, perhaps, that it took probably another 100 years, you're talking about a century here, to the the 1960s, in order for the African Americans, through the Civil Rights Bill, which was signed into law by President Lyndon Baines Johnson, who said remarkably that, quote, "we shall overcome," unquote, by borrowing a line from the great civil rights leader of the time, the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. That is when the African Americans, one could arguably say, sort of became very close to being full citizens of the United States of America.
Has anything changed when you look at the unprecedented events that have been happening, the multiracial, multi-generational social justice movement known as the Black lives matter. They seem to be fighting for the same things. It looks like nothing has changed in the last 100 years. Blacks in some parts of this country are still treated as if they are second or third class citizens, for that matter.
Skeptics will probably have a point in saying nothing pretty much has remarkably changed. But I think that optimists will say there is a lot you can look around and say, and point to, and say, yes, some progress has been made, but a lot more is yet to be done. So in other words, you still have a United States of America, which is not a perfect union, but there are still efforts to make it get somewhere close to a perfect union. I remember specifically back in 1968, Mexico City Olympics, where you had the Black Power movement, where 3 athletes put up the clenched fist. After one of them, Lee Evans, had not only won the gold medal of the 400 meters open, but in fact smashed the old Olympic and world record. And whenever you have a gold medalist like Lee Evans, he would therefore be awarded the gold medal. And during that ceremony, they would, of course, play the Spangled Banner. They would play the national anthem of the United States of America, and they would raise the flag of the United States. That is when you would actually see an African American enjoying that type of, citizenship, if you will. And there were so many African Americans that became champions on behalf of their countries. And therefore, they were able, through those international competitions, they were able to enjoy very briefly the status of being American citizens, simply because they had become the best at their race in the world at that time. They were also musicians, superstars, who were able also to be referred to as Americans. And nobody denied that, not even the white Americans. In fact, they were very proud of some of these people. And as things, proceeded on, you begin to have some individuals being appointed to very important government positions. For example, you had in the 1960s, again, President Lyndon Baines Johnson appointing the first African American to be the Solicitor General of the United States, Thurgood Marshall, and subsequently to be the Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And as we talk, Paul, you have an African American on the same bench whose name is Clarence Thomas.
Some people say that he really doesn't represent the blacks. He's more conservative than the actual conservatives themselves.
You
like to use the term, he's more Catholic than the Pope.
Well, it seems to me that when you look at his record of ruling and what have you, you could probably have a point for that. But the fact of the matter is, he is an African American. He is black. When your daughter, for example, Victoria, looks at the members of the U.S. Supreme Court, gets to know that some people who look like him can also sit on that bench.
Yeah.
And you also have had one African American who has occupied the White House, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, as the President of the United States, Barack Obama. You also have had a lot of other people who have distinguished themselves in different capacities. You can talk about General Colin Powell, retired but certainly not tired, who at one time became the first African American to become the Joint Chiefs of the Armed Forces of the United States. Looks like you and me, who became the first U.S. top soldier. You have also had him as the first black man to occupy the State Department as the top U.S. diplomat. You also have had Condi Rice, who have done that, not only as an African American, but as an African American woman. And you have had so many other people. You have had people that have distinguished themselves in all sorts of situations. So I think there is some improvement here and there. And in fact, when you go across the United States of America, you go to any university campus, including the Ivy Leagues, which begin with Harvard, or you go to Columbia, or you go to Cornell, or you go to Brown University, you go to the University of Pennsylvania, you will find the African American both in front of the class as a professor or a distinguished professor, and also in attendance. You will find some African American students studying there to become different things.
Let me first give a shout out to Joe Slavic, watching us from the city of brotherly love in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Let's go to some comments. So let's start with Linda K. I'm from the South. I remember as a young kid, my mother worked at a school that I attended. My father died when I was very young. There was so much hatred around us that we were very, very scared, sometimes even to walk out in the neighborhood where we lived. Everybody called us the N-word. But by God's grace, here we are today. We have something to celebrate. I think, what do you make of that comment?
I think that is great, Linda. One thing that I have to give credit to is people like you, your parents, and your great parents, who have been incredibly resilient, incredibly courageous, and incredibly visionary in order to have been able to survive through some of the most difficult situations that any human being has ever experienced. That has not made you get discouraged. The fact that you continued at least to keep hope alive, to work very, very hard, because in fact, the dominant culture, in order to even perceive you to be walking, you have to be walking faster. In order to perceive you jumping, you have to jump higher. In order to perceive you running, you have to run faster, to the extent that a lot of our cultural cousins have actually won a lot of gold medals at Olympic Games in different sprints. Black people are great people. They have done great things because they have great resilience.
Sometimes you and I have these conversations. We talk about the different experiences we've encountered living in this country. Both of us are blessed to be in this country. Both of us, I think, have benefited enormously from the system. But I would argue that we are in a totally different category. There are a lot of people who say the system has failed them. If you were to look back, maybe in your memory lane, what are some of those things that stand out? For example, for me, there are occasions where I've felt like my being American is not enough. For example, one time I was in one of the neighborhoods here. I walked into a men's warehouse. and I wanted to buy a suit for my dad. Actually, my dad had asked me to buy him a suit. He was celebrating his, I think, 65th birthday. So he wanted me to buy him a suit, and I walked into a men's warehouse store, and there were three white gentlemen who looked at me. For some reason, I don't know what they suspected. I was dressed nicely. I don't know what they saw in me, and they came and asked me if I needed help. I said, no, I'm looking for something. These are the sizes. I was in the right spot. I said, this, I know what I'm looking for, so I don't need your help. They insisted on, like, really asking me or to offer me help. I said, no, I'm fine. I don't need any help. I really know what I want. I'm not here to do like window shopping. I'm here to look for something. But what struck me that day was the fact that these people were really racially profiling me. They looked at me, judged me, and they said, no, I probably don't have the money to buy a suit. And before long, they called in another person, a fourth person. Now there are four people surrounding me. I'm in a store. I'm the only black guy. I thought that was something that really, really tested my faith. And since that day, let's say about 10 years ago, I've never gone back to a men's warehouse clothing store because of that particular incident that happened there. And I had money to buy cash.
That is because, unfortunately, there is what is called stereotype. You and I are being members of the black race in a country that was built, for example, on the basis of discriminating against other cultures by the dominant culture. Mind you, when the first constitution of this country was written, people who looked like you and me did not have citizenship. They did not see us under the definition of all men are created equal. They saw us as being a piece of property. As a matter of fact, we were facilitated in the Constitution as property. That is, if you were a black person, it meant that you were not free, just like your European counterparts. You were brought here forcibly, and you were here as a slave who had been bought, and you belonged to a specific master. And so that kind of mentality has, for some strange reason, continued to persist in the minds especially of the white members of the white race who happen to be ignorant, or who others might say who are racist. And despite that, Paul, I still insist, I have said this before, and I will say it again, that the United States is not the single most racist society on this planet Earth. Rather, I still believe that the United States is perhaps the single most racial conscious society in the United States.
I agree.
I think that what happens is when you go to a shop, you fit into the stereotype. I have experienced that before. I have, in fact, even been arrested by the cops some time back in California, in Fresno, because they said that I looked like somebody who fit a profile of someone that had actually hit a bank. But by interacting with me, they noticed that I had this heavy African accent.
So that
And they
became your
immediately-
ticket.
Unfortunately, it was only on that basis that they let me go. Their understanding was this is not the type of guy that can possibly pull off that type of job. And so it's about misunderstanding people. It's about putting down people because of prejudice. And the prejudice, racism, have actually been part of American society. I don't honestly think that every white human being looks at you simply because of your color, that you are not an equal human being.
You're absolutely right. I have so many white friends. When I lived in a predominantly white neighborhood in Iowa, I had the best time ever. Even here, where we live, most of my friends are white.
Yeah, but I think that when you and I come here from Africa, we exhibit a sort of naivety. We do not really understand the dominant culture here in the United States because we have not had an opportunity like our cultural cousins, the African Americans, or those Africans in the diaspora of America or Europe. We have not lived very closely, worked closely, gone to school very closely with people you call whites, sometimes referred to as members of the dominant culture. And therefore, sometimes it becomes difficult to gauge.
There is an interesting comment here from Reagan. He says, I think racism is the systematic disunity of one blood, human blood, especially with the variation of the skin color.
You know, Reagan, racism, as a matter of fact, can be defined in different ways. As I did my undergraduate studies at the State University of New York in Albany in the 1970s, I happened to come across a great professor. He taught us about racism. And he talked about individual racism. Then he went and talked about institutional racism. And these types of racism operate on different levels. Perhaps the kind of experience you run into in the store where you went to buy your father's suit, that could be characterized probably as individual racism. But you could also be in a situation where you are either denied access to an institution on the basis of your
color of your skin.
The color of your skin. That is institutional racism. And that is something that the great Martin Luther King Jr. had something to say about it just before he was assassinated in Memphis. You recall he talked about how I have been to the top of the mountain and I have seen the promised land. And he said, one day I had a dream that one day my children will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. He talked about that. He also even went further and talked about how, like the manner in which you are treated. He said, injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. Others say that, in fact, he said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
That's a very interesting point. Let's go to Joseph here. He says, there's a lot of talk about police reforms in the United States. should it just be about police reforms or the entire justice system? Because he said the justice system itself needs to reform for there to be a police reform. Your take?
No, very true, but even perhaps a little bit further. I think that there should be a fundamental reform which looks at any human being, irregardless of their color of the skin, irregardless of their gender, irregardless of their sexual orientation, irregardless of their religion or sectarianism, irregardless of their ideology. There should be something consistent in looking at all those people simply as members of one human family. They should be respected as human beings who have inalienable rights to live and enjoy, not endure, life on this planet Earth. All people should be considered as the same in the context of dignity. Everybody should have dignity. Everyone should have a right to own an opinion, however different it may be from yours, or however different it may even be to the party or the regime in the power, wherever that is applicable.
Let me bring up something here. You talked about so many different things, but I wanted us to look at, for example, again, going back to the justice system here, where you have, I think, a broken down system, where you have, for example, in some places, where you have the prosecutors in cahoots with police department, then the judges lock up people, because at the end of the day, these prisons, the prison system here in most places is run as a corporation. All these people are using free labor, and guess what? Most of the people in these private prisons are black people. So how can we talk about like police reform without really looking at the heart of what is broken in the justice system here in the United States?
I have sometimes alluded to this. I have talked about how, for example, change, however necessary it is, you should accept the fact that it is neither an incident nor an event. Change is a process and takes a long time to kick in. But I think, first and foremost, we must look at the future generation, the young people. We must make sure that some of these important things we are talking about, the things that some would call values that bring everybody together as part of the human family, should be made to be part of educational curriculum, so that as kids, you actually start learning and studying and imbibing some of these cultural values, including social, economic, cultural, political justice for all.
Shaka, that's a wrap. I thank you so much. I look forward to hosting you on another edition. Thank you.
You're most welcome, sir.